and really thank everyone for listening to me, because as you might have been warned, this talk does not directly support the Earl of Oxford as the candidate. And because I know I'm speaking to independent thinkers who all question assumptions, I am not going to tell you what to think. I'm just going to explain how I think about a problem that we all care about. So to begin, I'm going to describe my theory of mind approach, and then I will explore how this might inform our search for the author. So psychiatrists coined theory of mind to describe the process of constructing a mental picture of another person's internal state. Psychiatrists practice theory of mind when we evaluate patients, but we all use theory of mind to form connections and also to anticipate how other people are going to behave. So applied to the Shakespeare authorship question, it's basically a bottom-up strategy that can create or construct a forensic profile of the author. Is there a way I can get this up a little bit higher? Maybe not. So some of you are probably familiar with this. I think J. Thomas Looney essentially used a similar approach to identify the Earl of Oxford as Shakespeare. So although similar to Looney's, my process differs in a few key respects. First, instead of concentrating on the plays, I considered a smaller and more homogeneous data set. I focused solely on the sonnets and assumed only one thing. I assumed the sonnets would reveal some biographical information about the author. An idea I think many of us, or many of you probably share. Second, I utilized my psychiatric training to actually conduct a formal psychiatric evaluation of the author. So scholars often divide the sonnets into three groups based largely on the subject matter. The first 126 sonnets, called the fair use sonnets, reflect the voice of an older man expressing a range of emotions to a much younger man. The next 26 speak rather harshly of and to a dark lady. The last two recount anecdotes that occur when Cupid has fallen asleep. So to me, the voices differ, not just the subject matter. Therefore, I chose to focus on the largest group of sonnets that, in my opinion, instantiate a single voice. I've learned as a scientist that the cleaner your data, the better your results. So the fair use sonnets are my clean, well-defined data set. To apply the theory of mind approach properly, we need to discard all of our assumptions about Shakespeare and the authorship question. This includes ignoring accepted chronologies, dates, and even nationalities. I decided early in my quest for the author that once we reject the man from Stratford, we should abandon many of the traditional scholars' assertions, including the dates of the works. So traditional scholars have always forced the dates of the works to conform with the Stratfordian's biography. If the biography of the Stratfordian, I call him the Stratfordian, not the man from Stratford, so excuse my terminology, but if the biography no longer dictates the dates, we open ourselves up to many more possible candidates. And we may not want such a long list of possibilities, but I invite you today to put aside your biases, at least for the duration of this talk. So with the slate essentially wiped clean, we can perform our psychiatric evaluation on the fair use sonnets to construct the author's profile. Such an evaluation relies on what we call the mental status exam. In a different talk, I would walk you through all of the specifics of a mental status exam, but today I will just mention critical elements and then move straight to the diagnosis. The numbers here, the numbers here indicate which sonnet contains the specific information that I mentioned. So the clinical evaluation provides details of the poet's life, but also imbues him with a personal identity. As we begin to consider him as a person and not just a poet, his morbid ruminations about death and dying, his emotional dependency on the fair youth, and all of his personal losses evoke empathy and even pull at our heartstrings. We begin to worry about his extensive travels and his lack of an obvious home, which must add to his loneliness and social isolation. We wish we could help this elderly man in declining health who advises princes but seems almost lost, clinging to an unreliable fair youth who gives him so little in return. Yet along with the suffering, he also displays moments of joy and traces of grandiosity. Many personal strengths help him survive. His rich metaphorical language indicate a fertile imagination, but he never tips into frank mania or psychosis. Although he can imagine the world without his presence and even longs for death at times, something prevents him from reaching the point where he articulates a suicide plan or intent. Clearly, he trudges on with life despite the emptiness. His intelligence, perseverance, passion, and ability to express his feelings help protect him from the significant personal stresses burdening his life. Based on the poet's extreme fluctuations of mood, along with just the excessive volume of written output and hints of grandiosity, as a psychiatrist, I would diagnose him with bipolar disorder type 2. Type 2 merely means that the patient never loses touch with reality and does not become frankly manic. The diagnosis, however, implies something about his history. It turns out that 80% of people, up to 80% of people with this diagnosis have experienced prior trauma. Reactions to trauma depend on whether the victim suffers a solitary trauma or shares the trauma with others. There's something called a near-miss phenomenon, when you survive but others around you die, that can instill a sense of grandiosity or invulnerability in the survivor. So the author's profile suggests he experienced a public or shared past violent trauma. So with this profile in hand, I have developed a new theory about who wrote the Fair Youth Sonnets. The evidence that the poet experienced a past trauma provided an important clue. I won't take you through the 12-year-long circuitous journey that brought me here, but today for us, the story of the sonnets begins in the summer of 1572 in Paris, France, not London or Stratford. So in 1572, the French had been fighting a bloody civil war over their religious differences for 12 years. Finally, a royal marriage between a Protestant prince and a Catholic princess was planned to reconcile the two sides and solidify the peace. The characters relevant to the story were in Paris at the time and attended the royal wedding. 5 days after the ceremony, on the night of August 23rd, 1572, an eerie clanging of bells rang through the streets of Paris. The bells were a signal. They signaled the Catholic mob to attack their Protestant guests and neighbors. Over the next 3 days, the mob clubbed, stoned, stabbed men, women, and children to death. The Catholics killed defenseless Protestants on their knees in prayer, dismembered others, threw bodies out of windows, and beheaded anyone they could. The stench, mutilated bodies, and terrified screams transformed Paris into a living nightmare. The terror then spread out from Paris to the rest of France. Over the next 2 weeks, an estimated 40,000 victims died violent deaths. Villains emerged that night, but so did heroes. Hubert Languet, I've been pronouncing him Hubert Languet for about 10 years, but I learned from Google that it's Hubert Languet. The diplomat for the Elector of Saxony acted heroically. Because Parisians knew him as a prominent Protestant, his life was in danger. But as a diplomat, he had immunity and was allowed to carry a sword. So a sword in hand, he scoured the streets, escorting terrified Protestants into safe hiding. Even when a gang of Catholics disarmed and overpowered him, he did not stop his efforts. In prison, he substituted the pen for the sword, writing letters to his friends throughout Europe, requesting they provide safe harbor for Protestant refugees. He saved countless lives, and many recognized his heroism. Philip Sidney, a 17-year-old Englishman, nephew to Queen Elizabeth's favorite courtier, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, found himself surrounded by violence in Paris on that fateful night. Philip had just embarked on a grand tour of Europe. A few months before, Philip had suffered the humiliation of witnessing his former fiancée, Anne Cecil, marry his arch rival, someone with whom we are all familiar, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Anne had broken off her engagement with Philip in order to marry Edward. Philip, imperiled by his religion on the night of the massacre, barely avoided danger. The French Queen Mother, knowing his association with Queen Elizabeth, had him escorted to the safety of the English ambassador's residence. So then, with the help of the English ambassador and his network of Protestant sympathizers in Europe, Philip escaped France, traveling first to Frankfurt and then on to Vienna. In Vienna, Philip and Hubert formed an instant friendship. Despite their 36-year age difference, they bonded over the traumatic nightmare in Paris and their shared intellectual interest in the classics, from Cicero to Ovid. But young Philip did not hide out in Vienna long. After a brief respite, he left the safety and stimulation of Hubert's company for Venice, his intended destination all along. When Hubert and Philip parted ways, they vowed to exchange frequent letters. Thus begins a 7-year-long correspondence narrated entirely in Latin. Although published in 1633, these Latin letters remained untranslated and largely unread until the mid-19th century. Hubert peppers his intimate, often humorous, frequently painful letters with political gossip and quotes from the classics. The letters animate Hubert and provide extraordinary insight into his life and mind. In total, Hubert sends 96 long letters to Philip over the course of 7 years, whereas Philip only wrote 17 replies over the same time period. But when Philip does respond, he composes beautiful, empathic, insightful messages that differ from any other letters he drafts in his life. Hubert emotionally depends on Philip's letters, always wanting more. Although I originally concentrated on Philip's letters, when I circled back and to read Hubert's, the resemblance between the poets and Hubert's mental status exam struck me. Hubert, an elderly, lonely man, exhausted by travel and encroaching lameness, shares many, if not all, of the characteristics I had identified in the poet. Hubert and the poet both suffer from bouts of depression, morbid ruminations about death, and fears of abandonment. They both soar into moments of grandiosity, and their love for younger men consumes their emotional energy and infects their minds. Their obvious intelligence, classical references, and high-capacity output mirror each other. Like my feelings towards the poet, Hubert and his dependency on Philip evoked my compassion. Philip's long silence started to irritate me. I found myself wishing Philip would write more frequently to Hubert. At one point, Philip drags out 6 months before responding to a letter in which Hubert essentially cries out for help, admitting to a mounting depression. How could Philip ignore Hubert's suffering and disappoint his friend to such an extent? But despite Philip's unreliability, he always manages to come through in the end, and his compassionate letters, infrequent though they are, ensnare Hubert, and Hubert continues to write his steady stream of messages. The ups and downs of Hubert's relationship with Philip remarkably recapitulate the highs and lows of the relationship between the poet and the fair youth. Although the similarities struck me, the true realization of what this could mean did not quite dawn on me until I read this passage. Seeing your likeness at our friend Abandio's so moved me that when I came home, I wrote these little verses, which I am sending you. Could little verses mean sonnets? Did we actually have evidence that Hubert wrote sonnets, and not just any sonnets, but sonnets to a younger man that could easily fit the description of the fair youth? The modern translator of the Correspondence, Roger Kuhn, discounts this. In the footnotes, he states, such little verses in the Renaissance are just a few words often inscribed onto paintings. But despite the translator's dismissal, I still wondered if little verses could mean more. I remembered a similar line in one of the sonnets. I searched through the sonnets and froze when I read the lines. A portrait of Philip had inspired Hubert to compose little verses, and here in Sonnet 21, the poet admits, so is it not with me as with that muse, stirred by a painted beauty to his verse. A portrait had inspired both Hubert and the poet to write sonnets to a fair youth. We also know that Philip receives the verses. He responds, as for the verses, which doesn't sound like just a couple of words, they are delightful inasmuch as they will be a perpetual legacy of your feelings for me. He then explains he will not inscribe such proclamations of my praises on his portrait. Thus, Philip's response suggests the verses are more meaningful than a few odd words intended for an inscription. As crazy as it may seem, this is when I began to wonder if Hubert Languet had authored the Fair Youth Sonnets. Now, as I read Hubert's letters, more and more passages reminded me of lines from the sonnets. I will provide you with just a few of the echoes between the letters and the sonnets that I hear. As I detail these, please listen for the similarity of voice, language, and tone. So germane to our theory of mind argument is that the poet and Hubert both seem to have survived past violent trauma. In Sonnet 31, the poet refers to friends who have died as a result of their religious faith. He mourns, all those friends which I thought buried, how many a holy and obsequious tear hath dear religious love stolen from mine eye. In his moments of despair, Hubert also remembers friends who have died because of the religious faith. Referring to the massacre of Protestants in Paris, Hubert bemoans, "Fortune dealt me the deadliest blow in France, robbing me almost in one instant of all the friends I had there." I think we might all agree that traditional scholars have never suggested that the man from Stratford lost friends due to a religious conflict. Despite their history of trauma, an ability to love supports both the poet and Hubert. The poet derives solace from his friendship with the fair youth. After grieving over the loss of his friends to death in Sonnet 30, the poet discloses, "But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end." Hubert's love for Philip also comforts him through his despair. Hubert admits, "My mind is exhausted and oppressed by the calamity of my country. The only thing left to delight me is the memory of our friendship." The poet and Hubert both morbidly ruminate about death. The poet even begins Sonnet 66 with a morbid longing, "Tired with all these, for restful death I cry." Hubert also descends into the same depths of hopelessness, almost yearning for death, professing, "I see that my life is no use to anyone now. Death must free me from the miseries in which I live." Hubert's admission echoes the poet's cry for restful death. Both the poet and Hubert adore their younger men with a single-minded intensity. The poet declares, "Let not my love be called idolatry, nor my beloved as an idol show, since all alike my songs and praises be, to one, of one, still such, and ever so." Likewise, Hubert attests, "If I wanted to indulge my feelings, I should write to you about nothing but my love for you." So little points of contact and isolation may not impress you, but as I read and reread both the sonnets and the letters, they began to commingle in my mind to the point where I almost could not distinguish whether I had remembered something from the letters or from the sonnets. Once I heard Hubert's voice in the sonnets, I could not unhear it. For example, when I read Sonnet 34, Hubert's voice from an early letter reverberated. The poet declares, "Ah, but those tears are pearl which thy love sheds, and they are rich and ransom all ill deeds." Hubert also reminds Philip of his tears, writing, "The vehemence of which those tears of yours witnessed at your leave-taking, which scarcely let you say goodbye to me." Philip had failed to keep Hubert abreast of his progress and his safety. So Philip's tears, like the fair youth's, reassure Hubert and allow him to forgive Philip for his inconsideration. Anxiety about the constancy of their beloveds grips both men. The poet never quite believes the fair youth will remain attached and loyal. In Sonnet 92, the poet rails, "But do thy worst to steal thyself away, thou canst not vex me with an inconstant mind." Hubert, too, desperately worries, and sometimes with good reason, about whether Philip's initial emotional attachment will persist. From afar, he imagines the worst when Philip lives in Italy, agonizing over whether Philip will steal himself away to travel in Italy or will return to Vienna for the summer. Hubert complains, "I was afraid when you were going to go off into Italy that something of the customs of that people would slowly steal into your soul, which even if it did not quite stain its radiant purity, would nevertheless make it slightly dingy." He then grumbles, "I might not have anything to reproach you with except inconstancy in friendship." Resemblances exist far beyond a shared emotional landscape. The poet and Hubert also experience similar life events. They both own portraits of their loved younger men, and the portraits' likenesses disappoint both the poet and Hubert. The poet denigrates the likeness of the fair youth's portrait, calling it a counterfeit. In Sonnet 16, the poet presumes a child would resemble the fair youth far more than the portrait does. The poet protests, and many maiden gardens yet unset with virtuous wish would bear your living flowers, much liker than your painted counterfeit. When Hubert receives the portrait of Philip, he objects. It seems to me rather to represent someone who looks like you than you yourself, and at first I thought it was of your brother. Both the poet and Hubert share a similar disappointment in the portrait of their youthful friends. The poet and Hubert command similar metaphorical language. Many scholars point to the theatrical references in the sonnets to confirm that the poet was a professional actor. By default, this supports their candidate, the man from Stratford. The first reference I found appears in Sonnet 15, that this huge stage presenteth not but shows. And then another occurs in Sonnet 23. The poet compares, as an unperfect actor on the stage who with his fear is put besides his part. To me, neither of these prove the poet is an actor, only that theatrical metaphors usefully convey meaning. Hubert uses similar theatrical metaphors in his letters. When discussing the political turmoil in Europe, he writes with irony, how beautifully everything is being set up to act out in Spain, the same kind of tragedy we have acted in France in recent years. Indeed, the actors, young and fiery as they are, may not want to wait that long. Later, he advises Philip, your virtue was needed on another stage, which I wish you had chosen in these regions. So despite his familiarity with theatrical metaphors, Hubert never earned a dime as an actor, and no one would have made the claim that he was a professional actor. So by comparing the letters to the sonnets, we can even potentially pinpoint the date of a given sonnet, almost down to the month. In Sonnet 45, the poet delights in a swift exchange of letters between himself and the fair youth. By those swift messengers returned from thee, who even but now come back again, assured of thy fair health, recounting it to me. This told I joy, but then no longer glad, I send them back again and straight grow sad. So this reminds me of a brief period of time when Philip writes more frequently, even sending 3 letters in quick succession. In one, Philip responds to Hubert's plea for news of his health, reporting, I have nothing else to write except, and that I know will make you happy, that I am still enjoying excellent health. If the poet's delight in hearing news of the fair youth's health in Sonnet 45 is indeed a recounting of Hubert's joy in Philip's quick response and his good health, this sonnet, even though it is numbered 45, most likely represents an early composition dating from either late December of 1573 or early January 1574. Finally, no discussion of the fair youth sonnets can ignore the unusual topic of the Procreation sonnets. In 17 of the fair youth sonnets, the poet encourages the younger man to marry and father a child. Few adult men who do not share the tie of kinship would find themselves conflicted over this issue. The poet deploys several types of arguments to persuade the fair youth to marry and have children, including an appeal to a sense of duty. The poet implores, the eyes before duteous now converted are, unlooked on diest unless I get a son. Like the poet, Hubert appeals to Philip's sense of duty. For my part, I wish you were ensnared already so that you could sire your like for your country's sake. Hubert presses Philip to marry and father children many times over the course of 3 years, waging all the same arguments as the poet. So what, we might ask? Perhaps these are two separate men who both experience trauma, who happen to love younger men, and both express their feelings through sonnets. How can we tell if Hubert really did write the fair use sonnets? I would argue the proof lies in the explanatory power of this hypothesis. If Hubert's letters actually help us understand the sonnets to a greater extent than we would without them, this increases confidence in our hypothesis. So I hope the following examples will at least pique your curiosity, even if they don't increase your confidence. I will mention 2 times when the letters helped clarify rather opaque passages in these sonnets. The first is a reference that I would not have recognized if we did not have the letters to guide us. The poet writes cryptically, "And the firm soil wind of the watery main, increasing store with loss and loss with store." I did not understand this reference until I read Hubert's letter from 1577. Hubert and Philip rendezvoused along the mouth of the river Main in Germany, conversing about potential marriage plans for Philip. Hubert obliquely reminds Philip of this conversation. He writes, "See that you remember what I said to you at the mouth of the Main, and write to me about that as soon as you can, as you have promised me several times." The watery Main must mean the Main River in Germany. I might add that the original published version of the sonnets actually capitalizes Maine as if it were a proper name. No biographies of the man from Stratford ever mention that he visited Germany or knew of the watery Main River. The second is an obscure passage in Sonnet 59. The sonnet reads, "Oh, that record could with a backward look, even of 500 courses of the sun, show me your image in some antique book." This sonnet makes more sense after we read Hubert's letter trying to persuade Philip to return to France by appealing to his French heritage. If only there still lived in you your old desire to tread the soil which 500 years ago welcomed your forefathers at their birth. Philip traces his ancestors back to the Normans who invaded England in 1066. Having read the letter, it now appears that Sonnet 59 is referring to the fair use ancestors from 500 years ago. Part of the explanatory power lies in the influence Philip has on Hubert, and as a result, indirectly on the sonnets, or at least may have on the sonnets. In January of 1574, Philip seems almost to plant the seed of an idea directly into the poet's mind. Philip urges Hubert, "You will have to apply your mind to writing something so that your admirable virtue may also be known by some unusual monument to posterity." In Sonnet 55, the poet follows this directive, writing, "Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme." The more I read the letters, the more I could understand the sonnets. So I will finish by telling the final part of the story. Hubert's last letter to Philip ends the record of their relationship with some rather harsh criticisms about Philip's failure to live up to his potential. Hubert admonishes, "To waste the flower of your youth in the trifles and idleness of the court will be very bad for you." He then pressures Philip to leave England and join a military campaign on the continent in the service of the Protestant cause. 11 months later, Hubert dies in Antwerp without ever seeing Philip again. Philip sadly follows Hubert's advice, if somewhat reluctantly. When England prepares to join the war on the continent to assist the Protestants, Philip tries to stow away in one of Sir Francis Drake's ships destined for the New World. Queen Elizabeth discovers the plan and orders him back to London. Philip eventually joins the English troops in the Netherlands to fight the Protestants in their war against Catholic Spain. Just before his 32nd birthday, he dies from a battlefield wound. So where does this leave us? So what am I actually proposing? Against all odds, I am suggesting that Hubert Languet, a French Protestant, not an Englishman, composed the Fair Youth Sonnets, all originally in Latin, 46 years before their publication. If Hubert wrote the original sonnets in Latin, how can we know if the similarities between Hubert's letters and Shakespeare's sonnets are real, given the art and subjectivity involved in translation? Well, one of the benefits of Latin is its precision. I read the original Paris translation from 1845 first. Then I compared it to Kuhn's modern translation from 2012. The similarities exist in both translations, but I found one notable difference. Pear mistranslated the number 500 as 400, so I did not originally recognize Hubert's reference to Philip's French ancestors in Sonnet 59, the sonnet with the line, 500 courses of the sun. So if we can believe Hubert did indeed write the sonnets and compose them initially in Latin, then someone must have translated the Latin version of the sonnets into the English verses we know today. Can we identify the translator? Hubert wrote of, for, and to his fair youth, Philip Sidney. I suspect that Philip Sidney, the fair youth himself, and the recipient and object of the sonnets might have translated the Latin verses. Philip was the shining star of the English Renaissance and had all the credentials to have translated Latin sonnets into beautiful English verse. But Philip need not have been the translator. Several people who had access to Philip's personal effects and manuscripts after his premature death could have provided the translation. I might maintain one point, however. I might assert that whoever translated the sonnets from Latin into English imprinted them with some of the hallmarks of the playwright. Thus, the translator must have had some hand in the plays. So how does this impact the authorship question? Attributing the Fair Youth Sonnets to Hubert will be an almost insurmountable task, but such an attribution could also solve a lot of issues with the authorship debate. To be clear, I'm not proposing that Hubert wrote the plays. I'm suggesting that the author of the plays and the Fair Youth Sonnets in particular are two separate people. The sonnets were not included in the first folio, as someone pointed out before, which presumably contained the complete works of Shakespeare's. This may signify that another author other than the playwright penned the sonnets, or at least the Fair Youth portion of the sonnets. If Hubert wrote the Fair Youth Sonnets, then the author of the plays did not have to live until old age, nor did the author have to have been a man. This opens up the stage to many more possible candidates, perhaps even Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. To end, I want to thank my late father, a traditional Stratfordian English professor, who dragged me and my family to countless Shakespeare plays during my childhood, Mark Rylance for inspiring me to resume my search, Roger Kuhn and Stephen Pears for their translations of the letters, Michael Delahoyd for introducing me to the hosts of the Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable, and Rima Len and Sylvia Holmes for hosting me on their platform. I also thank Linda Teal for encouraging me to take a chance with this conference, and the committee, including Don Rubin, for taking a chance on me. But before I go, I want to leave you with one last image. This is the Bolton portrait of Sir Philip Sidney. It was painted posthumously in 1620, allegedly from an earlier portrait from 1585, a year before he died. I wonder why someone wanted a new portrait of Philip Sidney 34 years after his death, but just a few years before the printing of the first folio. Could it have served as a model for the famous Droeshout engraving of our everlasting poet? When we compare, okay, you just gotta let me do this one. When we compare the two images, we can see the ruff has similar points, the hair has the same asymmetry, the deep line from the ear to the chin that makes the engraving look like the head is disconnected from the body. They all exist, including the prominent bulbous forehead. So, although Philip died young, just before his 32nd birthday, Mary, his sister, and a poet in her own right, lived until she was almost 60. As other people have highlighted, the first folio was dedicated to her two sons and Philip's two nephews. And as we can see, swans adorned both Philip's engraving and Mary's lace collar. So why couldn't Hubert Languet have written Shakespeare's fair use sonnets, and the plays have been a progression of works that Philip originated, but then others, including Mary, transformed into what we know as the plays of the first folio. This is not the simple solution that we would all probably like, but if it were simple, the mystery would have been unlocked decades, if not centuries ago. So thank you. I'm really sorry I ran over.
No. Good job, Lisa. All right, we have a couple minutes for questions. Who's got a hand? You guys, okay, Roger. All right. Now you're in trouble.
I'm already sweating.
So first of all, thank you for clarifying, because all while you were talking, I kept thinking, are you saying that that Languet also wrote the plays or not? And you clarified that. You think there was a couple people involved. So I guess my question then is regarding your theory of mind methodology, because I heard you several times compare your theory to the Stratfordians, and I'm just wondering what in your research has led you to so definitely conclude that the material that you're citing in favor of your theory cannot also be cited in favor of De Vere's authorship. And much more simply, actually, because it doesn't require translation. I happen to, I'll throw out one other point and then I'll let you respond. Sidney to Languet, December 5th, 1573, I would I were sufficiently at home in Latin, or you in English. I personally find it extremely difficult to believe that those sonnets were written in Latin and then translated into English, but I'd like to hear your response.
Well, first, I just want to make sure that when I use the word Stratfordian, I often was referring to Shakespeare himself, so I wasn't necessarily saying the scholars that support it. So I think my terminology is not up to speed with you all. But as far as the translation, I think that's a huge bugaboo. And one of the things that Hubert tells Philip to do, which is to do this thing called the double translation, which Roger Ascham had really advocated at the Shrewsbury School, and a lot of English people in that time would do. So they would take a Latin text, translate it into English, and then retranslate it back into Latin to make sure it was the same. And Philip did this. We're pretty sure, because he talks to Hubert about doing it when he's in Italy. And so it's possible that if those sonnets are showing up as part of a letter, he might have done it on those sonnets as well. But it is interesting because some of the things like inconstancy that I mentioned, Okay, so Hubert uses inconstancy, 20 times in his letters, and I think the poet uses inconstancy or constancy or some variation 17 times in the poems. I can't quite remember the numbers. But I went into the Hubert's letters, and inconstancy in Latin is almost the exact same word. So that's not one of those words where there's a lot of subjectivity about what word you would use in English.
There are an awful lot of words where the English subject is central to meaning.
That the English meaning is central to the meaning, the English word itself.
No, I don't disagree. As I said, this is an insurmountable task to try to convince people that the fair use sonnets were written in Latin. I mean, how crazy can you be? But
this is Harvard Department of Psychiatry speaking, friends, okay? She does not represent, but she is so good. Thank you, Lisa. Beautifully presented.